Welcome back, traveler. Shake the rain from your cloak, pull up a chair to the hearth, and leave the burdens of the day at the door. Whatever troubles you faced out there, forget them for now. You have arrived at a place of warmth and memory. The fire is high, the ale is cold, and the history of our world is long. The last time we spoke, we witnessed the great and terrible end of the Third Era. We saw Martin Septim, the last of his line, shatter the Amulet of Kings and transform into the golden avatar of Akatosh to banish the Daedric prince, Mehrunes Dagon, back to the Deadlands. It was a victory bought with the ultimate sacrifice, a moment of divine brilliance that saved all of Mundus from total consumption. If you have not yet heard that tale of fire and heroism, I encourage you to seek out my previous record of those events. And if you find these stories bring you peace in the dark of night, a simple like and a subscription to our archives helps keep the hearth burning for all who wander. Now then, let's look upon the ashes of the Empire and the dawn of the Fourth Era. The transition from the Third Era to the Fourth Era was not merely a change of dates on a calendar or a turning of a page in a dusty ledger. It was a fundamental, bone-deep reshaping of the metaphysical and geopolitical foundations of the world. In the immediate wake of the Oblivion crisis, the Imperial City did not feel like the center of a victorious empire. It felt like a tomb. The air still carried the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the heavy, choking scent of brimstone that had lingered since the barriers between the mortal realm and the plains of oblivion were torn asunder. Within the Temple of the One, where the great battle had reached its climax, the massive stone statue of the dragon god of time stood as a silent, eternal sentinel. It was a beautiful and haunting reminder of Martin Septim's sacrifice, but to those who walked the halls of power, that golden avatar was also a marker of an ending. When Martin Septim gave his life, he did more than just banish a Daedric prince. He effectively ended the Septim bloodline. For hundreds of years, the legitimacy of the Empire had rested upon the shoulders of the Dragonborn emperors. They were the ones who sat upon the ruby throne, wore the Amulet of Kings, and lit the Dragonfires in the Temple of the One to keep the veil between worlds intact. The covenant between Akatosh and the mortals of Tamriel was a tangible, living thing. He manifested in the blood of the rulers. But now, that blood was gone. The Amulet of Kings, that ancient artifact of immense power that had bound the souls of emperors past, lay in countless tiny, glimmering shards upon the temple floor. The Dragonfires were no longer needed, for Martin's sacrifice had sealed the gates of oblivion forever. But with that finality came a terrifying question that began to whisper through the streets of the capital. Without a Dragonborn, what was the Empire? In the first weeks and months of the Fourth Era, a profound and heavy silence settled over the white gold tower. The ruby throne, a seat of power that had commanded the loyalty of an entire continent, sat empty. The absence of a Septim heir created a vacuum of authority so vast that it seemed to swallow the very light of the Imperial Council chambers, while the Elder Council, the body of high-ranking officials and noble statesmen who managed the bureaucracy of the realm, found themselves in a state of unprecedented paralysis. They were men and women of high birth and long experience, yet they were utterly unequipped for a world where the divine mandate of the Emperor had simply vanished. They spent their days in endless circular debates, their voices echoing off the cold marble walls, while the provinces of the empire began to look toward the capital with growing skepticism and unrest. The theological mandate for imperial rule was fundamentally compromised. For generations, the people of Tamriel had believed that the emperor ruled because he was chosen by the divines, a belief reinforced by the daily presence of the Dragonfires. Without that religious weight, the empire was no longer a sacred institution. It was merely a political one, and a fragile one at that. High Chancellor Ocato, a man of immense dignity and a veteran of the late Uriel Septim VII's administration, was the only individual capable of maintaining even a semblance of order. He had been the administrative backbone of the empire during its most trying hours, and now he found himself standing alone at the helm of a sinking ship. High Chancellor Ocato was an Altmer of great age and wisdom, a man who had seen the rise and fall of many fortunes within the imperial court. He did not seek the crown, nor did he attempt to claim the title of emperor, for he knew that such a move would be seen as a grab for power that could ignite a civil war. Instead, he reluctantly assumed the title of potentate. It was a title of regency, a temporary stewardship meant to stave off total collapse until a permanent solution could be found. But as the first year of the Fourth Era stretched into the second, and then the third, it became clear that there was no easy solution. There were no hidden heirs, no distant cousins with a legitimate claim to the throne, and no miraculous signs from the heavens to guide the way forward. Ocato's regency was characterized by a sense of restive tension that permeated every corner of the empire. In the outlying provinces, from the frozen peaks of Skyrim to the sun-drenched coasts of the Somerset Isles, the absence of a septum was interpreted as a sign of imperial senescence. The infrastructure that bound the continent together began to fail. Roads that were once patrolled by the Imperial Legion became infested with bandits and monsters, and trade routes that had flourished under the peace of the Septums began to wither as local lords took advantage of the chaos to levy their own taxes and disrupt the flow of goods. The Imperial Legion itself, depleted by the brutal fighting of the Oblivion crisis, found it increasingly difficult to project power beyond the heartland of Cyrodiil. The High Chancellor worked tirelessly, often late into the night, his chambers in the white gold tower illuminated by a single, flickering candle as he pored over reports of rebellion and decay. He was a man holding back a flood with his bare hands. He dispatched emissaries to the provinces, pleaded with the Elder Council for unity, and attempted to reorganize the remnants of the military to protect the most vital interests of the state. Yet, every fire he extinguished seemed to ignite two more elsewhere. The religious and political unity that had defined the Third Era was shattering like the amulet of kings itself. In the temples, the priests struggled to explain why the Dragonborn line had been allowed to fail, and in the marketplaces, the common folk spoke in hushed tones about the end of the world. This era of uncertainty and fragmentation was not just a political crisis. It was a psychological one for the people of Tamriel. For over 400 years, the name Septim had been synonymous with the very idea of civilization. To be a citizen of the Empire was to be part of something grand, something protected by the gods themselves. Now that protection felt distant, and the future felt dark. The catastrophic shifts in the natural world, and which would eventually lead to the return of ancient terrors in the north, were already beginning to cast long shadows across the land. The loss of the central authority meant that every province was now left to face its own demons alone, and as we shall see, those demons were many and varied. The paralysis of the Elder Council was perhaps the most tragic element of these early years. These were individuals who had spent their lives navigating the intricacies of imperial law and courtly intrigue, yet in the face of this absolute vacuum, they could only bicker over protocol and precedent. Some argued for the election of a new dynasty from among the noble houses of Cyrodiil, while others insisted on a lengthy search for any trace of the dragon blood. Their inability to act with decisiveness allowed the spirit of rebellion to fester. In the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the potentate's agents, ambitious men and women began to sharpen their blades and gather their forces, sensing that the age of the law was being replaced by an age of the sword. The empire was no longer a unified body, but a collection of sundered pieces, held together by the sheer will of a single high elf who refused to let the dream die. But even the strongest will can be broken, and the foundations of the world were shifting in ways that even High Chancellor Ocato could not foresee. The metaphysical weight of Martin Septim's sacrifice had secured the borders of the world against the Daedra, but it had left the heart of the world vulnerable to the ambitions of mortals. As the first decade of the Fourth Era drew to a close, the silence of the Ruby Throne became a deafening roar, a signal to the enemies of mankind that the Lion of the Empire was old, toothless, and very, very alone. As the first decade of the Fourth Era unfolded, a heavy, suffocating blanket of uncertainty remained draped over the heart of Tamriel. High Chancellor Ocato, the elder statesman who had served as the very backbone of the Empire during the long twilight of Uriel Septim VII's reign, found himself a ruler in all but name. He had seen the fires of the Oblivion crisis consume the world, and now he was tasked with sweeping up the ashes. He assumed the title of potentate not out of ambition, but out of a cold, desperate necessity to keep the machinery of the state from grinding to a final, absolute halt. The Ruby Throne sat empty, a silent and mocking reminder that the blood of the Dragonborn had failed, and in its place, Ocato sat at a simple wooden desk, drowning in a sea of reports that detailed a continent slowly coming apart at the seams. The transition from a sacred empire to a secular one was a jagged and painful process. For centuries, the people had looked to the white gold tower and seen not just a palace, but a lighthouse of divine protection. Without a dragonborn emperor to light the Dragonfires, the very theological mandate for imperial rule was fundamentally compromised. The common folk, the merchants, and even the minor nobles began to feel that the gods had turned their backs on the House of Septim, and by extension, on the empire itself. In the temples, the silence of Akatosh was deafening. This lack of a divine seal led to what many historians would later call an era of imperial senescence, a feeling that the great lion of the West was not merely wounded, but dying of old age. Throughout the first several years, Ocato's regency was defined by the restive nature of the provinces. From the distant, sun-scorched deserts of Elsewhere to the misty woods of Valenwood, the outlying regions began to interpret the empty throne as an invitation to self-governance, or worse, to rebellion. They saw a potentate who was an elf ruling over a human empire, and they saw a military that was stretched so thin it was transparent. The failing infrastructure of the empire became a physical manifestation of this decline. The great Imperial Road, which once allowed the legions to move with lightning speed from one end of the continent to the other, began to crumble. Bridges collapsed and were replaced with rotting timber. Way stations were abandoned to the elements, and the once reliable postal service of the Couriers Guild became a gamble. Bandits, sensing the weakness of the central authority, began to claim the wilds, making travel between the great cities a perilous undertaking for anyone without a personal guard. In the Imperial City itself, the atmosphere was one of quiet, dignified dread. Ocato moved through the halls of the white gold tower like a ghost, his face lined with the weight of 1,000 crises. He was a veteran of the council, perhaps the last man alive who truly understood how the complicated gears of the Elder Council turned. He spent his days negotiating with greedy Nibonese merchant lords who wanted tax breaks and Colovian warlords who demanded more funding for their local militias. Every coin he spent on a bridge in High Rock was a coin taken from a garrison in Cyrodiil. It was a zero-sum game played with the lives of millions. The infrastructure was not just stone and mortar. It was the trust of the people, and that trust was eroding faster than the walls of the capital. The High Chancellor knew that his position was precarious. He was an Altmer, and while he had served the Septums with a loyalty that few humans could match, there were those in the Somerset Isles who saw him as a traitor to his race, and those in Cyrodiil who saw him as an elven usurper. He worked in the shadow of the great statue of the Avatar of Akatosh, a monument to a sacrifice he was now forced to manage. He attempted to maintain the illusion of a unified empire, but the reality was a fractured collection of territories held together by ancient treaties that no longer felt binding. The provinces were no longer looking to the center for leadership. They were looking inward, preparing for a future where the empire was nothing more than a memory. This period of fragile stability, of holding one's breath while waiting for the other shoe to drop, lasted for nearly a decade. But the enemies of the empire were not resting. In the shadows, away from the flickering candlelight of Ocato's study, plans were being laid by those who viewed the collapse of the Septum Line not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The rise of elven supremacism was beginning to stir in the southwest, a movement that watched the potentate's every move with predatory patience. They did not want to fix the empire. They wanted to dismantle it, stone by stone, until nothing remained of the human-centric world order. In the 10th year of the Fourth Era, the fragile peace finally shattered. The details of that night are often debated by scholars, but the outcome was undeniable. High Chancellor Ocato, the man who had stayed the hand of chaos for 10 long years, was assassinated. The act was a surgical strike against the very heart of the imperial administration. There was no grand battle, no public execution, just a silent blade in the dark. While the killers were never officially caught, the act was widely attributed to agents of a rising power from the Somerset Isles, elven operatives who recognized that as long as Ocato lived, so the empire had a brain. With his death, they severed the last nerve. The assassination of potentate Ocato was the true end of the Third Era's lingering spirit. He was the last veteran statesman capable of navigating the fractured and bickering Elder Council. He was the bridge between the old world of the Septums and the new, harsh reality of the Fourth Era. When he fell, that bridge collapsed. The Council, already prone to paralysis, descended into a state of total panic. There was no one left with the authority or the respect to command the room. The administrative backbone of the empire was broken, and the 17 years of civil war that followed would turn the heart of Tamriel into a slaughterhouse. The death of the potentate sent a shockwave through the provinces. In Skyrim, the Nords saw it as the final proof that the empire could no longer protect its own, let alone its subjects. In Morrowind, where the ground was already beginning to tremble with the first hints of a coming cataclysm, the news of the assassination was a grim omen. The restive provinces were no longer merely restless, they were preparing for the end. The failing infrastructure was now completely ignored as the local rulers focused entirely on fortifying their own borders. The Great Imperial Road became a road to nowhere. High Chancellor Ocato's regency had been a desperate attempt to maintain order in a world that had lost its divine anchor. He had been a man of law in a time of lawlessness, a man of tradition in a time of collapse. His tragic end marked the beginning of what would be known as the Stormcrown Interregnum. This was an era defined by violent internal conflict and the complete disappearance of central authority. The silence that followed his death was not the peaceful silence of a forest, but the eerie, expectant silence of a battlefield before the first charge. The empire was no longer sundered. It was headless, and the vultures were already circling the white gold tower. The loss of this single statesman removed the last barrier against the ambitions of warlords and the subversion of foreign powers. Without Ocato to mediate, the Elder Council became a nest of vipers, each member looking to secure their own power at the expense of the realm. The theological mandate was gone, the political unity was dissolved, and the very ground of Cyrodiil was about to be soaked in the blood of its own people. The dawn of the Fourth Era had been cold, but its first decade ended in a darkness that promised to last for centuries. With the death of the High Chancellor, the last flicker of the old world was extinguished, and the heart of the empire was plunged into a deep, suffocating darkness that would last for nearly 2 decades. This era, known to history as the Stormcrown Interregnum, was a time of fragmented shadows and broken promises, where the rule of law was replaced by the rule of the blade. From the 10th year of the Fourth Era until the 17th year of the Fourth Era, the province of Cyrodiil was no longer a beacon of civilization, but a scarred and smoking battlefield where the ghosts of the past were trampled under the boots of ambitious men. The central authority that had once reached from the shores of the Abatian Sea to the marshes of the east simply vanished, leaving a void that was quickly filled by the echoes of clashing steel and the cries of the desperate. The Elder Council, once a body of the most distinguished minds and veteran statesmen in Tamriel, found itself paralyzed by the very vacuum it was meant to fill. Without the steady hand and administrative genius of Ocato to guide their deliberations, the counselors turned upon one another like starving hounds over a single scrap of meat. Their debates were no longer about the preservation of the empire's legacy or the protection of its citizens, but about which of them could seize the most influence in the coming storm. This internal rot allowed for the emergence of warlords, men who saw the empty ruby throne not as a sacred seat of the Dragonborn, but as a prize of war to be taken by anyone with enough strength to hold it. When in the Nibonese East, where the rivers run slow and the air is thick with the scent of ancient traditions and courtly intrigue, a man known as Thos the Gibbering rose to prominence. He was a Nibonese warlord who briefly occupied the Imperial Palace, treating the hollowed-out shell of the White Gold Tower as his own private fortress. History remembers him with a name that suggests madness or an unstable, frantic energy, a fitting symbol for a city that had lost its mind. To the people of the Imperial City, who had for centuries lived under the stable and dignified rule of the Septim Emperors, Thules was a mockery of everything the throne stood for. He was a pretender who sat upon a seat he did not understand, surrounded by the fading echoes of a dynasty that had been chosen by the gods. Meanwhile, the capital became a site of frequent and horrific skirmishes. Rival warlords like Eder Olin vied for control of the city's districts, turning the jewel of the empire into a charnel house. Ritualistic violence became a common sight in the streets, as the different factions used the symbols of the old empire to justify their own atrocities. The gardens of the palace were left to grow wild, the shops of the market district were boarded up or looted, and the great imperial bridge became a checkpoint where passage was bought with blood rather than coin. For 17 long years, Cyrodiil bled from 1,000 small wounds, each one a testament to the fact that the glue holding the world together had finally dissolved. While the Nibonese pretenders bickered and burned in the streets of the capital, a different kind of power was rising in the west, among the rugged hills and hardy folk of Colovia. Titus Mede I was a man forged in the crucible of military necessity. He was not a prince, nor was he of a line that could trace its blood back to the stars. He was a warlord, a soldier who understood that in a world where the Dragonfires had gone out, the only thing that mattered was the strength of one's arm and the loyalty of one's men. He watched the chaos of the interregnum from his Colovian strongholds with a cold and calculating eye, waiting for the exact moment when the factions in the capital had exhausted their resources and their will to fight. In the 17th year of the Fourth Era, Titus Mede I made his move. He did not march with a grand host of tens of thousands, for the old legions were scattered and the lands were too ravaged to support a massive army. Instead, he led a disciplined and highly mobile force of under 1,000 men, a small but razor-sharp army that moved with a singular purpose. He descended upon the Imperial City with the precision of a surgeon, capturing the capital and ousting the pretenders who had occupied it for so long. His capture of the Ruby Throne was not framed as a conquest, but as a liberation. He positioned himself as the man who could end the barbarism and restore the order that had been missing since the death of Martin Septim. The ascension of Titus Mede I marked a fundamental shift in the very nature of what it meant to be an emperor. His claim was not based on divine right, nor was it supported by the ancient scrolls or the blood of the Dragonborn. It was based on the pragmatic reality of military dominance and the ability to maintain the peace. He was a ruler of men, not a servant of the gods, and his crown was made of iron rather than myth. While his rule lacked the religious weight that had defined the septums for hundreds of years, it offered something the exhausted people of Cyrodiil craved far more: a future without civil war. Even the proud Nords of Skyrim, looking down from their frozen peaks, recognized the necessity of a stable Cyrodiil. They understood that the collapse of the Heartland would eventually mean the collapse of continental trade and the weakening of their own defenses. Consequently, the province of Skyrim officially endorsed the ascension of Titus Mede I, giving the new dynasty a vital spark of legitimacy in its earliest days. The Mede dynasty was born not in a temple of light, but in a city of ash, and its survival would depend entirely on its ability to hold by force what it had taken by courage. The Stormcrown interregnum had finally come to an end, but the scars it left on the land and the minds of the people would never fully heal. The Empire was no longer a sacred covenant between the mortals and the divines. It was a political entity held together by the will of a Colovian soldier. As Titus Mede I began the long and arduous process of stabilizing the core of the empire, he knew that the peace he had bought was a fragile one. The world was still changing, and the shadows that had gathered during the 17 years of chaos were not easily dispersed. The era of the warrior emperor had begun, and the first true test of this new order would soon arrive not from the ambitions of men, but from the very earth itself in the east. While the heart of the empire was occupied with the rise of a new dynasty and the struggle to reclaim a sense of normalcy after the fires of the Oblivion crisis, a far more ancient and celestial threat was gathering over the eastern province of Morrowind. To understand the darkness that was beginning to swallow the land of the Dunmer, one must look up, far above the spires and cantonments of the great city of Vivec. There, suspended in the sky like a held breath, floated the celestial meteor known as Baar Dau. For centuries, this moonlet had served as a symbol of divine protection and a grim reminder of divine power. Legends told that it had been hurled at the city by the Daedric Prince of Madness, Sheogorath, in a fit of spiteful whimsy. It had been intended to obliterate the city and its people, but the living god Vivec had simply reached out his hand and frozen the rock in its tracks, holding it motionless through the sheer force of his will. Under his protection, the Dunmer had hollowed out the meteor and turned it into the Ministry of Truth, a prison for dissidents and those who questioned the orthodoxy of the tribunal temple. For thousands of years, the rock had remained as a silent sentinel of the God King's love, but that love was anchored to a power that was slowly beginning to fade from the world. During the chaotic days of the Oblivion crisis, when the gates were opening across Tamriel and the Daedra were spilling into the streets, the living god Vivec vanished. With his disappearance, the ancient, a magical bond that held Baar Dau in its unnatural suspension began to decay. The meteor did not fall all at once. Rather, it began a slow, agonizing descent that only the most observant mages and priests first noticed. It was as if the very air holding the rock aloft was thinning, and the weight of the heavens was finally demanding its due. The people of Vivec City began to live in the shadow of a ticking clock, one made of stone and spite, as the magic that had defied gravity for eras was finally flickering out. The realization that the god was truly gone and that his works were failing sent a shockwave of terror through the heart of Morrowind. Without the divine will of the tribunal to sustain the province, the Dunmer were forced to look toward mortal ingenuity to save themselves from a celestial execution. So, a group of the province's most brilliant and desperate mages, led by the Dunmer mages Vuhon and Sul, came together to find a way to anchor the rock back into the sky. They knew that no single mortal soul, no matter how powerful, could replicate the will of a god. They needed a source of power that was constant, renewable, and immense. Their solution was a marvel of dark engineering and tragic necessity, a machine known as the Ingenium. The Ingenium was a complex and terrifying device, a fusion of arcane science and soul manipulation that was designed to act as a magical anchor for the celestial meteor. It was a massive, clanking structure that hummed with a sickly, ethereal light, and its purpose was as simple as it was horrifying. It consumed souls to generate the magical force required to keep Baar Dau from resuming its original and catastrophic momentum. In the beginning, the mages attempted to justify the cost of the machine's operation. They fueled the Ingenium using the souls of the condemned, criminals, dissidents, and those whose lives were deemed forfeit by the state. The machine required a constant and heavy tithe to function, initially consuming the souls of 10 individuals every single day. For a time, this dark bargain seemed to work. The descent of the rock was halted, and the people of Vivec City returned to their lives, trying to ignore the hum of the machine and the fact that their safety was bought with a daily sacrifice of life. Vuhon and Sul became the stewards of this fragile peace, two men bound together by the impossible weight of saving their nation. But as the months turned into years, the Ingenium grew more demanding. The magic required to hold a falling moon became increasingly unstable, and the machine's efficiency began to waver. The mages found that the souls of the ordinary and the broken were no longer enough. The Ingenium required something more potent, something that carried the weight of true significance. The atmosphere in the shadow of the meteor grew thick with a creeping dread. The mages worked in a state of constant, feverish exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the gauges and ley lines that monitored the rock's position. Vuhon, in particular, became obsessed with the machine's perfection, his mind increasingly consumed by the cold logic of the arcane at the expense of his own humanity. Sul, however, began to see the rot that was setting in. He saw the hollow eyes of the families of the sacrificed, and he felt the spiritual toll that the Ingenium was exacting on the land itself. The two mages, once united by a common goal, began to drift apart as the moral cost of their creation became too heavy for Sul to bear. The crisis reached its breaking point when the supply of disposable souls ran dry. The authorities were no longer just executing criminals, they were looking for any excuse to feed the machine. Vuhon, desperate to keep the rock aloft and fearing the total annihilation of his people, began to look closer to home for the power the Ingenium craved. He realized that a single, powerful soul, willingly given or deeply connected to those who operated the machine, might provide a level of stability that 1,000 common souls could not. It was this cold, calculated desperation that led him to target Ilsheven. 'Tis a woman who was the lover of his colleague and friend, Sul's. Vuhon believed that by using the soul of someone so closely tied to the work, he could bridge the gap between mortal effort and divine permanence. He attempted to fuel the machine with Iljevin's soul, an act of such profound betrayal and cruelty that it shattered the partnership between the two mages forever. When Sul discovered what was happening, the conflict that erupted between the two men was not just a battle of spells, but a collision of two different worldviews. One that would sacrifice anything for the survival of the state, and one that believed a world saved by such means was not a world worth living in. Their struggle took place within the very heart of the facility housing the Ingenium, to the air crackling with the violent release of energies that were never meant to be handled by mortal hands. The machine, already strained to its limit, could not withstand the interference of their magical duel. As spells clashed and the soul vessels within the device began to fracture, the delicate balance that held the meteor in place was irrevocably destroyed. The Ingenium, the great and terrible hope of the Dunmer people, did not merely stop working. It was obliterated in a surge of uncontrolled magical feedback. In that moment, the silent contract between the land and the sky was finally torn up. Without the mechanical anchor of the Ingenium or the divine will of Vivek to hold it, the celestial meteor known as Baar Dau suddenly regained every ounce of the momentum it had lost thousands of years ago. It was no longer a stationary monument. It was once again a weapon of mass destruction, a piece of the heavens falling with the concentrated force of 1,000 hammers. The 5th year of the 4th era was about to become the most tragic date in the long history of the Dunmer, as the shadow of the rock finally touched the earth. The people of Vivek City had only moments to look up and realize that their time had run out. The mages Vuhon and Sul, the very men who had tried to prevent this moment, could only watch as the consequences of their choices and their conflict hurtled toward the ground. The looming catastrophe was no longer a distant threat or a mathematical probability. It was a physical reality that was about to reshape the geography of northern Tamriel forever. The air began to scream as the meteor compressed it, and the water of the scathing bay began to boil before the rock even struck the surface. The era of the Ingenium had ended in fire and betrayal, and the era of the Great Ash was about to begin. The impact was not a sound at first, but a pressure that flattened the very concept of silence. When the celestial rock known as Baar Dau struck the city of Vivek in the 5th year of the 4th era, it did so with the accumulated momentum of thousands of years. For centuries, the magic of the living God had been the only thing standing between the people of Morrowind and a cosmic execution. And when the Ingenium finally shattered, following the desperate and tragic struggle between the mages Vuhon and Sul, the heavens claimed their long overdue debt. The meteor, which had served as a grim prison for so long, became a hammer of absolute destruction in striking the scathing bay with a force that historians would later describe as the power of 1,000 hammers hitting an anvil at once. In a single heartbeat, the grand cantonments of Vivek City, those floating wonders of architecture and faith, were not merely crushed, they were vaporized, transformed into a fine mist of stone, salt water, and the souls of those who could not flee in time. As the meteor buried itself deep into the crust of the earth, the displacement of the bay's waters created a wall of steam and brine that reached hundreds of feet into the air. But the physical destruction of the city was only the preamble to a much larger cataclysm. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact sent a massive shockwave rippling through the tectonic plates of the region, traveling north toward the heart of the island of Vardenfell. Deep beneath the surface, the ancient and restless fires of the Red Mountain were jolted into a state of unprecedented agitation. The impact acted as a trigger, a final shove to a mountain that had been simmering with divine and volcanic pressure for eras. The resulting eruption was not a gradual release of pressure, but a violent, earth-shaking explosion that fundamentally altered the geography of northern Tamriel. The top of the Red Mountain was essentially blown into the atmosphere, sending a colossal column of fire, brimstone, and obsidian glass into the sky. The light from the eruption was reportedly visible from as far away as the Imperial City, a jagged, angry red scar on the eastern horizon that signaled the death of a province. Molten rock poured down the slopes of the volcano in rivers of liquid fire, incinerating everything in its path. The lush forests, the ancient ancestral tombs, and the bustling trade settlements that had defined the landscape of Vardenfell were obliterated in minutes. The island, once a place of pilgrimage and power, was transformed into a wasteland of cooling magma and jagged stone, a landscape so hostile that it became essentially uninhabitable for the living. But the fire was only half of the horror. As the mountain vented its fury, it released an incomprehensible volume of volcanic ash, a thick, gray, suffocating shroud that began to drift across the inner sea. This was not the gentle ash of a hearth fire. It was a heavy, abrasive grit composed of pulverized rock and toxic minerals. It fell upon the mainland of Morrowind not in flakes, but in meters, burying entire cities under a weight that the sturdiest structures could not withstand. Coastal towns that had survived the initial shockwaves were now swallowed by the falling gray snow. The sun was blotted out for months, plunging the region into a perpetual, twilight-tinted gloom where the air itself was a poison that burned the lungs of any man or mer who dared to breathe it. This catastrophic event, which forever carved its name into the history of the world as the Red Year, was a turning point for the Dunmer people. It was the moment they realized that the era of their gods was truly and finally over. The destruction of Vivec City left a gaping, boiling crater in the earth that would come to be known as the Scathing Bay, a place where the water hissed against the heat of the underlying magma for decades. For the loss of Vardenfell was more than just a loss of territory. It was the loss of their cultural heart. Much of the mainland was buried under meters of ash and fire, leaving the survivors to wander through a landscape that no longer resembled the home they had known. The Red Year forced a total reappraisal of what it meant to be a child of Morrowind. In the immediate aftermath, as the fires still burned and the ash still fell, the survivors could only look to the west and north, toward the borders of other provinces, searching for any chance of survival. The disaster had stripped away the pride of the great houses and the comfort of the temple, leaving only the raw, cold reality of a diaspora. The sky remained a bruised and angry red for years, a constant reminder of the day the mountain woke up and the world turned to ash. It was a time of wandering, of grief, and of a slow, painful migration toward the unknown. As the Dunmer fled the ruins of their civilization, to find refuge in lands that had once been their rivals. The environmental fallout extended far beyond the borders of Morrowind, as the ash clouds disrupted weather patterns across the continent, leading to failed harvests and a sense of encroaching doom even in the heart of the Empire. But for the Dunmer, the Red Year was an absolute ending. The geography of their home was permanently altered. The scathing bay replaced the jewel of their architecture, and the Red Mountain stood as a silent, smoking monument to their displacement. As the survivors began the long trek toward the borders of Skyrim, carrying only what they could fit on their backs, they left behind a province that was a shadow of its former self, a land of fire, ash, and the echoes of a fallen divinity. The Red Year had turned the sky to a bruised and angry purple, and the land of the Dunmer to a choking, monochromatic gray. But the physical destruction was only the beginning of a long and bitter walk into exile. Thousands of refugees, their lungs burning from the fine volcanic glass, and their eyes stinging with a mixture of salt and grief, began a mass migration that would forever change the demographic face of northern Tamriel. They fled west toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Velothi Mountains, leaving behind an ancestral home that was now little more than a landscape of fire and jagged obsidian. Many of these displaced souls found their way into the province of Skyrim, seeking shelter within the ancient, frost-cracked stone walls of Windhelm and the coastal heights of the city of Winterhold. In Windhelm, the High King permitted the refugees to settle in a cramped, sunless district that would eventually be known to all as the Grey Quarter. It was a place of damp stone, crowded tenements, and bitter memories, a world away from the grand mushroom towers and golden plains they had lost to the mountain. In the 16th year of the Fourth Era, recognizing the sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis and the fact that the Dunmer people had no other sanctuary to call their own, the High King of Skyrim performed an act of significant diplomatic mercy by ceding the island of Solstheim to Morrowind. This island, once a contested territory of frozen forests and dark, ice-bound mines, became a vital haven for the displaced, by providing a small scrap of sovereignty for a people who had lost their living gods and their physical world. It was a gesture that saved thousands, yet it could not mend the broken spirit of a nation that felt itself abandoned by the heavens. While the people struggled to find new ground for their feet, their spirits were undergoing an equally radical and painful transformation. The disappearance of the god Vavek and the utter catastrophic failure of the tribunal's ancient works had left a spiritual void as vast and echoing as the crater where Vavek City once stood. The old temple, which had for thousands of years preached the absolute divinity of Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek, collapsed under the weight of its own perceived obsolescence. In its place, the Dunmer returned to the ancient shadowed paths of their ancestors. They rebranded the three good Daedra, Azura, the Prince of Dawn and Dusk, Boethia, the Prince of Plots, and Mephala, the Spinner of Webs, as the Reclamations. Under the guidance of a reformed institution known as the New Temple, the people sought to reclaim the spiritual roots that had been obscured by the long centuries of tribunal rule. They turned once more to the princes of fate, struggle, and secret murder to guide them through their darkest hour, believing that their survival now depended on the very harshness they had once tried to transcend. But even as they sought solace in their new faith, a sharp and vengeful blade was being sharpened in the marshes to the south. In the 6th year of the 4th era, taking advantage of a Morrowind that was literally buried in ash and broken by divine abandonment, the Argonians of Black Marsh launched a massive and brutal invasion of southern Morrowind. For centuries, the great houses of the Dunmer, most notably the ruthless slavers of House Dress and the eccentric magisters of House Telvanni, had treated the native people of Black Marsh as little more than cattle, stealing their children from the mud and exploiting their labor in the salt rice fields. The memory of that systemic cruelty had not faded in the humid air of the South. During the heights of the Oblivion crisis, while the Empire's legions were being pulled back to protect the heartland of Cyrodiil, the mysterious Hist trees had performed a miracle of their own. They had recalled the Argonians from every corner of Tamriel, calling them home to defend the marsh with a psychic urgency that could not be ignored. So the result was a battle-hardened, fanatically organized military force that even the Daedra of the Deadlands could not break. Under the leadership of the nationalist and isolationist faction known as the An-Silil, this vengeful Argonian army marched north with a singular bloody purpose. They were not merely seeking territory, they were seeking a final reckoning for generations of bondage. They sacked the ancient and holy capital city of Mournhold, putting its grand structures to the torch and slaughtering any Dunmer who did not flee before their swift and silent advance. Southern Morrowind was essentially annexed or rendered entirely uninhabitable for the Dunmer people as the Argonians reclaimed the lands of their ancestors with fire and spear. This conflict, which many historians refer to as the Accession War, was only halted by the desperate and heroic military mobilization of House Redoran. As the Empire had effectively withdrawn its military protection to focus on the chaos in Cyrodiil, House Redoran emerged as the primary defender of the Dunmer people, proving to all that while the gods might be gone and the Emperor distant, the warriors of the North still held their ground. The geopolitical fallout of this abandonment was total and irreversible. The Dunmer could not forget that when the sky fell and the Argonians marched, the empire of the Medes was nowhere to be found. This perception of a useless and decaying imperial state led to a seismic shift in the Council of Great Houses. House Hlalu, which had for generations been the primary architect of the alliance between Morrowind and the Empire, it was stripped of its status and officially removed from the Council of Great Houses. They were seen by the survivors as nothing more than puppets of a failed and distant regime, and their fall marked the end of significant imperial influence in the land of the Dunmer. Morrowind was now a land defined by ash, refugee camps, and a fierce, insular independence, guarded by the iron will of House Redoran and the ancient cold shadows of the reclamations. The province remained a wasteland of mourning, but its people were beginning to learn how to walk in the dark, even as the eyes of a new and golden enemy in the southwest began to turn toward the weakened heart of the world. While the east was drowning in ash and the north was shivering in the shadow of a headless empire, a new and terrible sun was rising in the southwest. The Somerset Isles, but that ancestral home of the High Elves, which had for eras been a place of unparalleled beauty and ancient wisdom, was undergoing a transformation that would eventually threaten to unmake the world of man. To understand this shift, one must look back to the dark days of the Oblivion Crisis, when the gates of the Deadlands opened even in the most secluded gardens of the Altmer. The most devastating blow to the elven psyche during that time was the fall of the Crystal Tower, a structure that was not just a palace or a library, but a metaphysical anchor for the Altmer people, a monument to their heritage that was thought to be indestructible. When the Daedra overran its defenses and brought the great spire crashing down, the trauma felt by the elven people was absolute. It was a wound that would not heal, but a sign that the old ways and the old alliances with the human empire had failed to protect the most sacred site in the elven world. In the vacuum left by this cultural catastrophe, a radical and long-dormant faction known as the Thalmor began to stir within the shadows of the Isles. They were not new to the political stage, but they were revitalized by the desperation and the anger of a people who felt betrayed by the distant human emperors in Cyrodiil. As the Daedra were finally banished from Mundus, the Thalmor did something far more dangerous than fighting. They took the credit. They claimed that it was not the sacrifice of a septum or the lighting of the Dragonfires that had saved the world, but rather the deep and subtle magics wielded by their own agents. It was a brilliant and hollow lie, one that fell upon fertile soil among a population looking for a reason to believe in their own superiority once again. They leveraged this manufactured popular support to position themselves as the only force capable of restoring elven dignity and securing the future of the Altmer race. By the 22nd year of the Fourth Era, the transformation of the Somerset Isles was complete and terrifying. The Thalmor orchestrated a series of political maneuvers and internal overthrows that effectively dismantled the pro-imperial monarchy that had ruled for centuries. The kings and queens, who had maintained ties with the Ruby Throne, were ousted, replaced by a totalitarian state governed by the rigid and xenophobic ideology of the Thalmor. To signify this new beginning and their total break from the human-led past, as the nation was officially renamed Alinor, a name that reached back to the ancient roots of their people, stripping away the imperial designation of the Somerset Isles. This was not merely a change in name, but a declaration of war against the status quo of the continent. The new regime in Alinor quickly revealed its true, iron-fisted nature. A systematic and cold-blooded purge began, targeting anyone who was deemed non-pure or who harbored sympathies for the human empire. Altmer who had lived in Cyrodiil for generations, scholars who advocated for diplomacy, and even those of noble blood who questioned the Thalmor's methods were silenced, imprisoned, or driven into exile. The gardens of Alinor, once open to the light of knowledge, were now patrolled by agents of a secret police that valued ideological purity above all else. The ideology of the Thalmor was one of absolute elven supremacy, a belief that the elves were the rightful masters of Tamriel, and that the human-led empire was a historical aberration that must be corrected. They viewed the very existence of the empire as a stain upon the natural order, and they dedicated themselves to the eventual dissolution of human power across the continent. But the Thalmor were not content to remain within the borders of their island fortress. Their eyes turned east, toward the ancient forests of Valenwood and the wood elves who dwelt within them. In the 29th year of the Fourth Era, the Thalmor orchestrated a swift and quiet coup within the Valenwood government. They leveraged long-standing internal divisions and exploited the weakness of the Imperial presence in the region to bring the Wood Elves under their direct influence. With the union of Alinor and Valenwood, the Third Aldmeri Dominion was officially born, a resurrected powerhouse that sought to rival the glory of the first Elven empires. Immediately following this consolidation of power, the Dominion took the drastic step of severing all diplomatic contact with the Empire of the Medes. The borders were closed, the embassies were shuttered, and a silence descended between the southwest and the rest of Tamriel that would last for nearly 100 years. This century of silence was not a time of peace, but a period of intense and focused buildup. Behind the closed borders of the Dominion, the Thalmor were transforming their society into a war machine. They modernized their navies, refined their magical doctrines, and engaged in a massive effort of subversion across the continent. They sent agents into the human provinces to gather intelligence, foment unrest, and prepare the ground for a future conflict they viewed as inevitable. They were patient, possessing the long lifespans of the elves, and they were willing to wait generations for the human nations to weaken themselves through internal strife and neglect. The rise of the Third Aldmeri Dominion was the most significant geopolitical shift of the early Fourth Era, a slow-motion catastrophe that the Mede emperors were ill-equipped to handle. The philosophy of the Thalmor was not just about political territory, it was metaphysical. They believed that by dismantling the empire and erasing the influence of man, they could return the world to a state of primordial elven grace. They saw the structures of the mortal world as a prison and the human god Talos as the ultimate jailer. While they did not yet move openly against the worship of the Ninth Divine, the hatred for the ascended man was already burning brightly in the council chambers of Alinor. Every ship built in their shipyards and every spell perfected in their academies was a step toward a world where the sun never set on elven rule. The Empire was a skeleton, and the Thalmor were the patient vultures waiting for the last bit of meat to fall from the bone. The atmosphere within Alinor during these years was one of a chilling, clinical beauty. The streets were clean, the architecture was pristine, and the music that drifted from the spires was harmonious, but it was a harmony enforced by the threat of disappearance. The purges were not loud, chaotic affairs. They were orderly, systematic removals of those who did not fit the Thalmor's vision of a perfected elven society. A family might be there one day, contributing to the arts or the sciences of their community, and gone the next, their names erased from the public records as if they had never existed. This internal cleaning was presented to the public as a necessary step to ensure that the magical strength that had supposedly saved them would not be compromised by foreign influence. In Valenwood, the transition was perhaps even more jarring. The Wood Elves found themselves suddenly under the administration of the rigid, protocol-obsessed Altmer. The coup was managed with a frightening efficiency, removing the traditional leaders who favored the alliance with the Empire and replacing them with those who saw the Dominion as their only hope for elven solidarity. The great walking cities of the Wood Elves became centers of Dominion administration, and the ancient forests were suddenly teeming with Thalmor observers, ensuring that the new order was upheld in every grove and clearing. The loss of Valenwood was a strategic nightmare for the Empire, as it placed a hostile power directly on the border of the southern heartland. Yet the Mede dynasty was too preoccupied with its own survival to do anything more than watch the border and wait. The Third Aldmeri Dominion was a monument to the power of a single, focused ideology in a world of fragmented intentions. While the Mada emperors were trying to manage a dozen different crises in a dozen different provinces, the Thalmor were focused on one thing: the restoration of elven dominance. This clarity of purpose gave them an advantage that no amount of imperial tradition could match. They were not building an empire for a decade or a century. They were building an empire for the rest of time, and they believed that every step they took, no matter how cruel or deceptive, was justified by the ultimate goal of elven liberation. The dawn of the Fourth Era had been marked by the fall of a human dynasty, but its first act was the rise of an elven one that would eventually bring the world to its knees. As the first century of the Fourth Era drew toward its close, the silence of the Dominion grew louder, and the first signs of their supernatural influence were about to manifest in the night sky. The quiet years were the most dangerous of all, for they allowed the Thalmor to refine their hate and their strength, while the Empire struggled to simply maintain its roads. The golden light of the southwest was no longer a sign of beauty, but a warning of the storm that was gathering. A storm that would eventually break over the whole of Tamriel in a wave of fire and gold, starting with a terror that would strike at the very hearts of the people of the desert. In the 98th year of the Fourth Era, a terror of a different, more celestial nature descended upon the warm desert sands of elsewhere. To the people of the Heartland, the moons, Masser and Secunda, were simply lights in the sky, markers of time and tides that guided the traveler through the dark. But to the Khajiit, the moons were the very architects of their existence. Their physiology, their very forms from the moment of birth, were determined by the phases of these two celestial bodies in a complex dance known as the lunar lattice. For 2 long and terrifying years, the great and the lesser moon simply vanished from the night sky, leaving the heavens a hollow, star-pricked void. This period, which would be whispered of in hushed tones as the Void Nights, was nothing less than a cosmic apocalypse for the Khajiit people. Imagine the profound, bone-deep dread that settled over the dunes and jungles of the south. The Khajiit are a people of deep spiritual connection to the firmament, and the sudden absence of their celestial guides felt as if the gods themselves had been murdered. For 2 years, Masser and Secunda did not rise to silver the sand or cast shadows through the palm fronds. The night became an unfamiliar, hostile place. More terrifying than the darkness, however, was the impact on the unborn. Without the phases of the moons to dictate their shape, the Khajiit feared for the very future of their race. They did not know what manner of children would be born in a world without a moon, or if the cycle of their lives had been broken forever. It was a time of stagnant, breathless waiting, where the only thing more oppressive than the heat of the day was the unnatural blackness of the night. The empire of the Medes is already struggling to hold its own borders together and still reeling from the various crises of the early Fourth Era, could offer no explanation and no relief. The Imperial scholars in the White Gold Tower pored over ancient star charts and consulted their telescopes, but they were as blind as the beggars in the streets. This inability of the central government to address a spiritual and physical catastrophe of this magnitude did not go unnoticed in the south. The Khajiit felt abandoned by their human allies, left to suffer in a dark world, while the emperor's advisors bickered over tax revenues and border skirmishes. It was into this vacuum of despair and neglect that the Third Aldmeri Dominion made its most calculated and brilliant move. In the 100th year of the Fourth Era, so the moon suddenly and miraculously returned to the sky. After 2 years of absence, the familiar silver glow of Masr and the pale light of Secunda once again bathed the world in their comforting radiance. The relief in Elsewhere was ecstatic, a tidal wave of joy that swept from the northern wastes to the southern coasts. But this joy was immediately channeled toward a specific benefactor. The Thalmor, the governing body of the Aldmeri Dominion, stepped forward to claim full credit for the restoration of the heavens. They asserted that through the use of their deep and subtle magics, the same mysterious powers they claimed had ended the Oblivion crisis, they had performed a ritual to bring the moons back from the void. Whether this was a true feat of arcane mastery or a masterfully timed piece of political theater, utilizing an astronomical cycle the elves had predicted through their long study of the stars, remains a subject of intense debate among historians. However, to the Khajiit at that moment, the how mattered far less than the result. They saw the Thalmor as their saviors, the only ones in all of Tamriel who possessed the power and the will to heal the sky itself. This manufactured miracle won the eternal gratitude of the Khajiit people, creating a bond of loyalty that was stronger than any treaty or trade agreement the Empire had ever offered. The Thalmor were no longer just a foreign power. They were the guardians of the moons, and by extension, the guardians of the Khajiit soul. The political repercussions of this event were swift and devastating for the unity of the human-led empire. So the gratitude toward the Dominion grew into a pervasive cultural shift within Elsewhere. The people began to see their interests as being fundamentally aligned with the elves of Alinor, rather than the humans of Cyrodiil. The tension between the old Elsewhere Confederacy and the distant Ruby Throne reached a breaking point. In the 115th year of the Fourth Era, 15 years after the moons returned, the Elsewhere Confederacy was officially dissolved. The unified nation that had stood for centuries ceased to exist, replaced by a return to an older, more fragmented social order. From the ashes of the Confederacy, 2 ancient kingdoms were reborn: Anakina in the north, with its harsh deserts and warrior traditions, and Palatine in the south, characterized by its lush jungles and merchant-dominated coasts. However, these were not independent nations. They entered the Third Aldmeri Dominion as client states, voluntarily ceding much of their sovereignty to the Thalmor in exchange for continued protection and favor. For the Empire, the loss of Elsewhere was a strategic catastrophe. It removed a significant buffer zone between the Dominion and the heartland of Cyrodiil, and placed the fierce and capable Khajiit warriors under the command of the Thalmor. The Void Knights and the subsequent dissolution of Elsewhere demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of the Thalmor's method of conquest. They did not need to march armies across the border to take the south. They simply needed to wait for a crisis and then position themselves as the only solution. By leveraging the spiritual vulnerabilities of the Khajiit, they dismantled a key piece of the Imperial puzzle without shedding a single drop of Altmer blood. The Empire of the Medes watched from the north, helpless and increasingly isolated as their former allies turned their backs on the human world to follow the golden light of the southwest. This era of subversion and manufactured miracles solidified the Dominion's position as the dominant power on the continent. They were no longer just an island nation. They were an expanding empire that understood the power of belief as well as the power of steel. As the moons continued their nightly transit over a divided Tamriel, the Thalmor watched from their towers, knowing that with every lunar phase, their grip on the south grew tighter. The Khajiit were now part of the elven machine, and the empire was one step closer to its final, to desperate struggle for survival. The darkness of the Void Nights had passed, but it had been replaced by a different kind of shadow, one cast by the long, grasping fingers of the Third Aldmeri Dominion. In the 48th year of the Fourth Era, while the Empire of the Medes was still struggling to consolidate its grip on a fractured continent, a supernatural horror of unprecedented scale manifested in the humid, vine-choked marshes of the southeast. The city of Lilmuth, a place of ancient stone and deep, stagnant water in the province of Black Marsh, became the first witness to a catastrophe that would eventually threaten the very heart of the world. It began not with the sound of drums or the clash of steel, but with a profound and unnatural silence that seemed to swallow the hum of the swamp's insects and the rustle of the wind through the reeds. High above the canopy of the trees, a massive, jagged shadow began to drift across the sun, casting the city into a premature and chilling twilight. This was the arrival of Umbriel, a floating island of stone and dread that had been summoned from the dark, shifting realms of oblivion to wreak havoc upon the mortal plane. The island of Umbriel was a terrifying anomaly, a piece of a Daedric realm torn away and anchored to the skies of Tamriel. It was not merely a rock, but a living predatory city of spires and shadows, populated by strange and hollow beings who served its dark master. As it hovered over the landscape, the island cast a terrifying shadow upon the earth below, and wherever that darkness passed, the very air seemed to thin and grow cold. The true horror of Umbriel, however, lay in its hunger. At the core of the floating city sat a device of terrible and familiar design, a new version of the Ingenium. This machine was a specialized magical engine that required an immense and constant supply of power to maintain the island's flight and its connection to the mortal world. Unlike the previous Ingenium that had attempted to save Vivec City, this one was designed for consumption. As Umbriel drifted over the living, it reached down with invisible, grasping fingers to suck the souls of those caught in its shadow into its belly to power the device at its center. The victims of this soul reaping did not find the peace of the grave. As their spirits were torn away to fuel the floating city, their physical bodies were left behind as empty, cooling husks. But the master of Umbriel had no intention of leaving these remains at rest. Through dark and unholy magics, the corpses were immediately reanimated, rising as part of a growing, shambling, undead army that followed in the wake of the floating island. This legion of the dead was tireless, fearless, and possessed a singular driven purpose: to slaughter any survivors and add to their own numbers. The city of Lilmuth was quickly overrun, its streets filled with the moans of the newly risen and the frantic cries of those who realized that their own neighbors and kin had become their executioners. The shadow of Umbriel moved with a slow, deliberate pace, carving a path of absolute desolation from the depths of Black Marsh into the ash-choked borderlands of Morrowind. This nightmare was not a random occurrence of nature or a simple invasion from oblivion. It was the result of a calculated and profound betrayal from within the very heart of the Imperial administration. The manifestation of the island had been orchestrated through a dark and complex ritual performed by Minister Hiram, a high-ranking official who sat at the right hand of Emperor Titus Mede I. Hiram was a man of immense influence and even greater resentment, a statesman who had grown tired of the pragmatic and military-focused rule of the new dynasty. He sought to seize the ruby throne for himself, believing that he was the only one capable of restoring the empire to its former mystical glory. To achieve this, he had made a secret and unholy pact with the ruler of the floating island, a being known as Lord Umbriel. The identity of Lord Umbriel was a testament to the lingering scars of the Red Year and the dark paths that grief and failure can forge. The master of the floating city was a fusion of two powerful and malevolent entities: the mage Vuhan, who had fled the destruction of the original Ingenium in Morrowind, and the sentient, soul-consuming sword known as Umbriel. Vuhan, twisted by his experiments and his desire for immortality, had found a way to merge his essence with the power of the blade, creating a new and terrible consciousness that existed only to consume and expand. Together, the minister and the lord of the island planned to use the unstoppable power of the undead army to march upon the Imperial City, overthrow the Mede dynasty, and usher in a new era of soul-fueled dominance. As the floating city moved north, but it grew in power and scale with every soul it harvested. The path it took was a trail of ghost towns and silent battlefields. The Imperial Legion, still recovering from the civil wars of the Interregnum and the loss of its central authority, was ill-prepared to face a threat that could fly over its fortifications and turn its own fallen soldiers against it. The shadow of Umbriel eventually crossed the borders of Cyrodiil, threatening the Imperial City itself and the very foundation of the Empire. The air in the capital grew heavy with the scent of decay and the low, vibrational hum of the Ingenium as the island approached. The people of the Heartland, who had only recently found a measure of peace under the rule of Titus Mede I, now looked to the sky with the same paralyzing dread that had gripped the citizens of Lilmuth. So the Emperor, recognizing that conventional military strength was useless against a city in the sky, found himself in a position of extreme vulnerability. His trusted advisor was the architect of his ruin, and his legions were powerless to stop the descent of the shadow. The defense of the realm would not fall to a grand army or a formal declaration of war, but to a small and unlikely group of individuals who were forced to navigate the blurred lines between heroism and staged legend. The Mede dynasty's legitimacy was being tested not by a rival warlord, but by a manifestation of the most ancient and dark magics of the past, reborn in the cold heart of a floating necropolis. The Umbriel crisis was a reminder that the Fourth Era was not just a time of political decline, but a time of metaphysical instability. The barriers that Martin Septim had died to seal were holding, yet the ambitions of men like Hiram and the remnants of past disasters like Wuhan could still find ways to tear holes in the fabric of the world. The floating island was a dark mirror of the empire itself, a collection of stolen souls and hollowed-out structures held together by a desperate and unsustainable need for power. As the island loomed over the white spires of the capital, the stage was set for a final confrontation that would decide if the throne of the Medes would survive its first true supernatural test, or if the heart of Tamriel would become just another harvested field for the master of the shadow. The mechanical drone of the island's core seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the white gold tower, a sound that many believed was the death rattle of the human world. The crisis highlighted the fragility of the new order, showing that without the divine protection of the Dragonborn, the Empire was perpetually one ritual away from annihilation. The shadow of Umbriel was the first of many such shadows that would define the long, dark century, a sign that the ghosts of the Third Era were not yet finished with the living, and that the price of survival in this new age would be paid in the currency of souls and ultimate sacrifices. The shadow of the floating city grew until it swallowed the sun over the heart of Cyrodiil, casting the white marble of the Imperial City into a premature and sickly twilight. As the 48th year of the Fourth Era ground forward, the dread that had begun in the far marshes of the southeast now loomed over the very seat of human power. The undead army, a shambling and tireless tide of those whose souls had already been harvested by the island's hunger, carved a harrowing path across the continent. From the drowned streets of Lilmouth to the ash-strewn borders of Morrowind, the transition of the floating necropolis left nothing but silence and empty husks in its wake. The Imperial Legion, once the invincible shield of the Septims, found itself pushed to the absolute brink of exhaustion and despair, as every soldier who fell in battle against the Shadow rose moments later to strike down their former brothers in arms. In this hour of terminal darkness, the defense of the Empire fell into the hands of an unlikely and fractured fellowship. At the center of this desperate resistance was Prince Titus Mede, the heir to the Ruby Throne. To the common folk of the Imperial City, Titus was a shining champion, a hero of song and legend whose exploits were whispered in every tavern. However, the bitter reality was far more hollow. The prince was initially a puppet hero, a young man whose supposedly daring adventures and narrow escapes had been meticulously staged and choreographed by his father's agents to bolster the legitimacy of the new dynasty. He was a man living a lie, decorated with honors he had never truly earned, until the shadow of Umbriel forced him to face a horror that could not be scripted. Beside the prince stood a figure of much grimmer purpose, a Dunmer named Sul, a survivor of the Red Year who had witnessed the very beginning of the end for his people. Yusul was a man driven by a singular, burning need for vengeance. He had spent years hunting the mage Wuhan, the man who had betrayed his trust and sacrificed the woman Sul loved to fuel the original Ingenium. Sul knew the true nature of the floating city better than any living soul, for he understood that the master of Umbriel was not merely a Daedric lord, but a fusion of Wuhan's twisted ambition and the malevolent, sentient power of the sword known as Umbra. Together, the staged hero and the broken mage embarked on a journey that would take them into the very heart of Morrowind's ruins. Their quest led them to the jagged and steaming remains of Vivec City, now nothing more than the scathing bay, a place where the water still hissed against the cooling magma of the earth. Amidst the obsidian shards and the lingering ghosts of a fallen divinity, they sought the only weapon capable of severing the link between the mages and the city's power source, the Umbra sword itself. The air at the scathing bay was thick with the scent of sulfur and the heavy weight of old failures, a landscape that mirrored the internal struggles of the prince as he finally confronted the reality of his own fabricated legend. It was here, in the cradle of the Dunmer's greatest tragedy, that Titus Mede ceased to be a puppet and began to forge the soul of a true leader. While the prince and the mage sought the means of salvation in the east, the Imperial City prepared for a siege unlike any in its long and bloody history. The defense was led by the remnants of the Imperial Legion and the Penitus Oculatus, the secretive and efficient organization that had risen as the successor to the disbanded Blades. Those men and women stood upon the walls of the capital, watching the horizon as the low, vibrational hum of the floating city's core grew loud enough to rattle the teeth in their heads. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the physical tide of the undead that beat against the gates, and another against the soul-reaping shadow that threatened to turn the city's entire population into fuel for the enemy's machine. The crisis reached its harrowing climax as the floating island finally drifted over the white spires of the white gold tower. The final confrontation took place within the nightmare architecture of Umbriel itself, a place where the laws of physics and the boundaries of life and death were woven together by the dark engineering of the Ingenium. Prince Atribus and Zul, having recovered the Umbra sword, infiltrated the city to strike at its heart. The battle was a chaotic storm of arcane energy and clashing steel, a desperate struggle against the fused consciousness of Wuhan and the Blade. In the end, the resolution of the crisis required a price that no staged legend could ever account for. Zul, the man who had lost everything to the Ingenium twice over, recognized that the only way to permanently destroy the power source was through a final, total sacrifice. He gave his own life to shatter the mechanical heart of the city, using his last breath to ensure that the man who had destroyed his world would never harm another. Nor as the Ingenium fractured and the magic sustaining the island began to fail, the entire structure threatened to collapse upon the Imperial City, which would have resulted in a catastrophe rivaling the Red Year. However, the intervention of an Argonian named Mir Glim, who had also been caught in the city's web, provided a final, miraculous reprieve. Using the shifting energies of the collapsing city, the island of Umbriel was transported out of the mortal plane and into the realm of the Hist, the mysterious and alien domain of the sentient trees of Black Marsh. The immediate threat was gone, and the shadow lifted from the Imperial City, but the victory was a somber and hollow one. The 48th year of the Fourth Era ended with the Empire of the Medes standing, but standing upon a foundation that was deeply cracked. The defense against the floating city had solidified the military legitimacy of the Mede dynasty, proving that they could protect the heartland even in the absence of the Dragonborn, yet the cost had been staggering. The Imperial Legion was heavily depleted, its ranks thinned by years of fighting an enemy that grew stronger with every casualty. The Penitus Oculatus, though successful in protecting the emperor from the internal betrayal of Minister Hiram, had seen many of its finest agents lost in the struggle. The people of the empire looked up at a clear sky once more, but the memory of the floating city lingered like a stain. They had seen that even with the gates of oblivion closed, the world remained a place of terrifying fragility, where the ambitions of a single minister and the ghosts of a fallen province could nearly unmake civilization. The Umbriel crisis was a turning point that moved the empire further away from its mystical past and deeper into a future defined by blood, iron, and the hard choices of mortal men. The stage was set for the long decline that would follow, as the institutions that had once governed the continent began to crumble under the weight of a world that no longer believed in the protection of the gods. The Fourth Era did not only witness the physical sundering of land and the death of ancient bloodlines, it also saw the slow, agonizing dissolution of the institutions that had served as the very pillars of the Septim Empire for centuries. As the central authority of the White Gold Tower began to fray, the great guilds that had once unified the provinces under a single banner of commerce, expertise, and imperial law began to fracture, mirroring the decay of the state itself. The most prominent, and perhaps the most mourned of these casualties, was the Mages Guild, an organization that had stood since the Second Era as the premier authority on the arcane across all of Tamriel. Its end did not come with a single explosion or a grand magical duel, but rather through the insidious rot of public distrust and the internal bickering of those who should have been its stewards. In the immediate aftermath of the Oblivion crisis, a wave of profound anti-magical sentiment swept through the cities of Cyrodiil and beyond. The common folk, still traumatized by the sight of blood-red gates opening in their streets and Daedra pouring out to slaughter their families, looked for a scapegoat for their suffering. The Mages Guild, which had long claimed the right to monitor and regulate all magical activities within the Empire, was seen as having failed in its most basic and sacred duty. People began to whisper in the marketplaces and taverns that the guild had been blind to the reek of the Mythic Dawn cult, or worse, that its own members had been complicit in the rituals that had nearly unmade the world. This public outcry became a roar that the Elder Council could not ignore, and at the very beginning of the Fourth Era, the Mages Guild was officially disbanded. The collapse of the guild did not mean the end of magical study, but it did mean the end of its unity. The organization splintered into two rival factions, each claiming to be the true successor to the guild's legacy, while embodying none of its original cooperative spirit. The first of these was the Synod, a group that prioritized political influence and the collection of powerful artifacts above all else. They became fixtures of the imperial court, weaving themselves into the bureaucracy of the Mede dynasty and treating magic more like a tool for statecraft and diplomacy than a field of academic inquiry. Opposite them stood the College of Whispers, a more shadowed assembly that focused on the study of forbidden magics, including the arts of conjuration and necromancy that the original Mages Guild had fought so hard to regulate. For the next 200 years, these two groups would engage in a cold war of scholars, more interested in sabotaging one another's funding and prestige than in advancing the understanding of the arcane for the benefit of the people. While the arcane halls of Cyrodiil were filled with the whispers of bureaucrats, the magical heart of the North faced a far more literal and devastating collapse. In the province of Skyrim, the Mages Guild had never truly held the same cultural dominance as it had in the south, largely due to the traditional Nordic skepticism of the clever craft. Instead, the Independent College of Winterhold, an institution that claimed to have been founded in the First Era by the legendary Archmage Shalador himself, remained the primary center for magical research in the province. For centuries, the college had sat perched upon its cliffs, overlooking the bustling and prosperous city of Winterhold. However, so the 122nd year of the Fourth Era brought a disaster that would change the face of the North forever: the Great Collapse. The event began with a series of supernatural and terrifying storms that battered the northern coast of Skyrim for days. The Sea of Ghosts, always a treacherous and icy expanse, rose up in a fury that defied natural explanation. Massive waves and tectonic shifts caused the very cliffs beneath the city of Winterhold to crumble into the dark, freezing waters below. Most of the once great city was swallowed by the sea in a matter of hours, leaving behind only a handful of buildings and a population hollowed out by grief and loss. Yet as the dust and sea spray settled, the survivors looked up to see the College of Winterhold standing completely unscathed upon its solitary rock, and connected to the mainland by only a thin, precarious bridge of stone. The fact that the college had survived while the city perished led to a permanent and bitter rift between the mages and the Nordic population. To the grieving citizens of Winterhold and the rest of Skyrim, the college's survival was not a miracle, but a smoking gun. Many locals suspected that the mages had either caused the disaster through some reckless experiment, or had, at the very least, used their power to protect only themselves while allowing their neighbors to drown. This suspicion hardened into a deep-seated hatred that would define the relationship between the college and the province for the rest of the era, further isolating the practitioners of magic from the society they occupied. As the arcane institutions crumbled, the martial pillars of the empire were also beginning to show signs of terminal fatigue. The Fighters Guild, which had once provided a regulated and reliable source of protection and mercenary work across the continent, saw its influence wane as the central authority of the empire fractured. In the province of Skyrim, the Fighters Guild found it impossible to compete with a far older and more culturally resonant organization, the Companions of Whiterun. The Companions were not a guild in the imperial sense. They were a brotherhood of warriors who traced their lineage back to the original 500 companions of Isgramor, the legendary figures who had first cleared the land for human habitation. Because the Companions operated on a traditional Nordic system of honor and personal merit rather than the cold, its paper-heavy bureaucracy of the Fighters Guild, they held the hearts of the Nordic people. In the mead halls of Whiterun, a warrior's worth was measured by the strength of their arm and the loyalty of their word, not by the seals on a contract or the dues paid to a distant factor in Cyrodiil. Consequently, the Fighters Guild never successfully expanded into Skyrim during the Fourth Era, leaving the defense of the province to these ancient, honor-bound fellowships. The disappearance of the guild's presence in the north was yet another sign that the imperial way of life was being pushed out, replaced by a return to the older, harsher traditions of the individual provinces. By the 201st year of the Fourth Era, the landscape of organized society in Tamriel had been fundamentally altered. The grand, multi-provincial guilds of the Septim Years were largely a memory, replaced by local factions, political splinters, and isolated colleges. The Mages Guild was a ghost, its former members more interested in the ear of the Emperor than the secrets of the stars. The Fighters Guild was a fading shadow, unable to project its influence into a Skyrim that had turned back to its own heroes. Even the Blades, the elite protectors of the Dragonborn emperors, had been officially disbanded and hunted to near extinction following the terms of a bitter peace treaty with the elves. These institutions had been the glue that held the diverse peoples of the empire together, and with their fall, the people of Tamriel found themselves increasingly alone in a world that was growing colder and more dangerous by the day. The shadows that stretched across the continent during these long centuries were not only cast by the crumbling towers of the law or the high peaks of the north. Some grew from the very depths of the earth, in the damp, forgotten corners where the moonlight never touched. While the public guilds of the empire were shattering into bickering factions and losing their grip on the hearts of the people, a much older and more terrifying order was entering a period of terminal decline that many believed would be its final, silent end. The Dark Brotherhood, that once feared assassination cult that had for centuries dictated the fate of kings and commoners alike through the cold whispers of the Night Mother, was fading into a ghost of its former self. Following the supernatural upheaval of the Oblivion Crisis and the subsequent fragmentation of the Empire, the organization suffered from a slow, grinding erosion of its sacred foundations, characterized by internal strife and a series of devastating raids on its most vital strongholds. For generations, the Brotherhood had operated as a religious body, as much as a guild of killers, bound by the strict and ancient codes known as the Five Tenets, and guided by the spiritual leadership of the listener. But as the Fourth Era progressed, that divine connection began to fray. The voices that once guided the hands of the assassins grew quiet, and the ritualistic precision that had made the Brotherhood an unstoppable force was replaced by a desperate, aimless survivalism. The sanctuaries, which had once been bastions of dark power hidden beneath the bustling streets of the Empire's greatest cities, became isolated islands of paranoia. Without the unifying presence of a true listener to interpret the will of the Night Mother, the different sanctuaries began to operate independently, losing the shared identity that had once made them the most feared society in all of Tamriel. The most crushing blow to the organization's integrity occurred in the 188th year of the Fourth Era, during a time of immense social unrest and civil violence in the western provinces. The city of Wayrest, a jewel of trade and culture in the province of High Rock, was suddenly and brutally sacked by a massive force of corsairs and opportunistic marauders. In the chaos of the city's fall, the Dark Brotherhood sanctuary located beneath its streets was discovered and completely destroyed. This was not merely a loss of soldiers or coin. It was a symbolic shattering of the Brotherhood's invincibility. The massacre at Wayrest sent a ripple of terror through the remaining members of the Order, as they realized that the shadows could no longer protect them from the harsh realities of a crumbling world. It was a time of fire and betrayal, where the ancient secrets of the cult were traded for safety or gold, and the once impenetrable web of the Brotherhood began to unravel strand by strand. As the years marched toward the 201st year of the Fourth Era, the decline became a terminal descent. Sanctuaries across Cyrodiil and the other provinces were systematically hunted down by local authorities or rival organizations, or they simply went dark as their members succumbed to internal purges and the weight of their own isolation. By the end of the 2nd century of this era, the Dark Brotherhood had effectively ceased to exist as a continental power. The grand halls of the Cheydinhal Sanctuary, once the heart of the Order's operations in the Imperial Province, were abandoned to the dust and the rats. The legendary influence that had once made even emperors tremble was now nothing more than a ghost story told to frighten children, a fading memory of a time when the darkness had a voice and a purpose. In the northern province of Skyrim, a single, lonely ember of the Brotherhood continued to flicker, though it bore little resemblance to the sacred order of old. Tucked away in a damp, pine-shrouded grotto near the town of Falkreath, the last active sanctuary in all of Tamriel survived by abandoning the very traditions that had once defined the cult. Under the leadership of a woman named Astrid, this remnant of the Brotherhood discarded the ancient 5 tenets, the laws that forbade the killing of fellow brothers and demanded absolute obedience to the Night Mother. They traded their religious fervor for a pragmatic, mercenary mindset, taking contracts not to serve a dark deity, but simply to keep their bellies full and their blades sharp. To the traditionalists of the past, this would have been seen as the ultimate heresy, a betrayal of the very soul of the organization. But in the harsh and unforgiving climate of the late Fourth Era, Astrid and her followers viewed it as the only way to endure. The Falkreath Sanctuary was a place of heavy, stagnant air and the smell of wet earth and old iron. The members of this final cell were a collection of outcasts and broken souls, men and women who had nowhere else to turn in a world that was tearing itself apart. They no longer listened for the whispers of the Night Mother, for she had been silent for so long that many doubted she had ever existed at all. Instead, they relied on their own wits and the word-of-mouth reputation they managed to scrape together in the taverns of Skyrim. They were no longer the hand of fate. They were simply highly skilled killers for hire, hiding in a hole in the ground while the storms of history gathered above them. The loss of the listener meant that the spiritual heart of the Brotherhood was dead, leaving only a hollow shell of violence and survival. But this decay of the Dark Brotherhood was a microcosm of the larger collapse of Imperial society. Just as the Empire had lost its Dragonborn emperors and its divine mandate, the Brotherhood had lost its listener and its connection to the void. Both institutions were clinging to the memories of a more stable past while trying to navigate a present that was increasingly defined by chaos and the absence of a central, guiding light. The internal betrayals that plagued the cult were a dark reflection of the political infighting that was bleeding the provinces white. In the shadows of the Falkreath Sanctuary, one could see the final, desperate gasps of an era that was refusing to go quietly into the night, even as its foundations were being swept away by the tide of the Fourth Era. The atmosphere within that final sanctuary was one of grim to defensive pride. Astrid and her small family of assassins looked out at a world that had forgotten them, and they took a perverse pleasure in their own survival. They mocked the old ways, the silly rituals, and the imaginary voices of the past, believing that they had evolved beyond the need for such superstitions. Yet beneath the bravado, there was an unmistakable sense of loss. They were the last of their kind, the final guardians of a legacy they were actively dismantling. Every contract they took was a step further away from the grand and terrifying history of their order, and every day they spent in hiding was a reminder that the world had moved on, leaving them behind in the damp and the dark. The terminal decline of the Dark Brotherhood marked the end of the age of the secret societies that had shaped the Third Era. The world of the Fourth Era was becoming a place where power was exercised in the open through the massed ranks of the Imperial Legion or the fanatical zeal of the rising elven supremacists. There was less and less room for the subtle blade and the whispered command. As the 201st year of the Fourth Era dawned, the Brotherhood was a wounded animal, backed into a corner and waiting for the final blow. Whether it would find a way to reclaim its lost glory or simply fade into the mists of legend remained to be seen, but the silence of the Night Mother seemed to suggest that the time for whispers was over, and the time for screams was about to begin once again. The history of these fading shadows is a reminder that nothing, not even the most feared and ancient of orders, is immune to the slow, eroding power of time and the shifting tides of human and elven ambition. The Brotherhood had risen on a wave of blood and faith, and it was now sinking into a sea of pragmatism and neglect. As the listener to this tale, you must understand that the collapse of these institutions was not a sudden event, but a long, slow cooling of the world's heart. The fires of the Oblivion crisis had burned away the old structures, and the cold that followed was deep and pervasive, reaching even into the most secluded sanctuaries of the dark. As the shadows of the secret societies and the ancient guilds grew long and thin, a much greater and more visible darkness began to gather on the southern horizon. The peace that the Mede dynasty had worked so hard to maintain was not a true peace, but a long, breathless pause before a storm that would eventually threaten to drown the entire continent in blood. In the 171st year of the Fourth Era, the fragile stability of Tamriel was shattered by a single, horrific act of diplomatic aggression. The tensions between the Mede Empire and the Third Aldmeri Dominion, which had been simmering in a cold silence for nearly a century, finally ignited into what history would remember as the Great War. The conflict began on a crisp day in the 10th month of that year, when a Thalmor ambassador arrived at the Imperial City to deliver an ultimatum to Emperor Titus Mede I. The demands were staggering in their arrogance and their reach. The Empire was to officially cease the worship of Talos, the ninth divine and the deified founder of the Septim dynasty. The legendary Order of the Blades was to be formally disbanded, and a significant portion of the southern coastline of Hammerfell was to be ceded to the Dominion. To the Emperor, These terms were not just a request for territory or a change in law, but a demand for the total spiritual and political surrender of humanity. When Titus Mede II refused the ultimatum, the ambassador produced a gold platter and removed a heavy, stained cloth to reveal the severed heads of over 100 Blades agents who had been operating within Dominion territory. It was a declaration of war written in the blood of the Empire's finest protectors, and within days, the Elven legions were marching across the border. The invasion was a masterclass in swift, clinical brutality, orchestrated by Elven commanders who had spent decades preparing for this exact moment. The Dominion forces were divided into two massive prongs of attack. In the heartland of Cyrodiil, the armies were led by the formidable Lord Nerefin, a general whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his alleged cruelty. Simultaneously, a second host under the command of Lady Aurelia struck deep into the province of Hammerfell, aiming to secure the southern lands the Emperor had refused to surrender. The Dominion achieved massive early victories, catching the Imperial legions off balance and under strength. The Elven soldiers, bolstered by superior magic and a fanatical belief in their own supremacy, moved like a golden tide across the southern reaches of the Empire. By the 174th year of the Fourth Era, the war reached its most harrowing and desperate stage. The Aldmeri forces had fought their way to the very gates of the Imperial City, surrounding the white walls that had stood for thousands of years as the center of human civilization. The siege was long and bitter, characterized by the constant drone of elven war spells crashing against the battlements and the desperate, starving cries of the citizens trapped within. In a move that many at the time viewed as an act of cowardice, but which history would later recognize as a necessary strategic retreat, Titus Mede II broke through the elven lines with his personal guard and fled north. He left the capital to its fate, regrouping with reinforcements that were marching down from the frozen holds of Skyrim and the rugged mountains of Hammerfell. The fall of the Imperial City was a catastrophe that scarred the psyche of the Empire. During the sack of the Imperial City, the Dominion forces showed no mercy to the city or its people. The white gold tower, the ancient and beautiful spire that anchored the heart of Tamriel, was systematically looted of its treasures and its dignity. Thousands of innocent civilians were massacred in the streets by the vengeful Altmer, who viewed the city not as a prize to be governed, but as a monument to human arrogance that deserved to be desecrated. For an entire year, the banners of the Thalmor flew over the Ruby Throne, and the heart of the Empire was a place of smoke, ash, and the quiet screams of the conquered. However, the Emperor was not defeated. He was merely waiting for the winter to pass, and for his strength to return. In the 175th year of the Fourth Era, Titus Mede II led a brilliant and desperate counterattack that would culminate in the Battle of the Red Ring. He divided his recovered and reinforced military into three massive wings, surrounding the capital in a giant pincer movement. The battle was a cacophony of clashing steel and roaring magic, as the combined might of the Nords, the Red Guards, and the remaining Imperial legions threw themselves at the elven occupiers with a fury born of 3 years of humiliation. The fighting was so intense that the waters of the Lake Rumare were said to have turned pink with the blood of the fallen. In a stunning reversal of fortune, The Aldmeri army within the city was completely destroyed, and the seemingly invincible Lord Narifin was captured alive by the Emperor's forces. It was a total tactical victory, the greatest triumph for human arms in over a century. The elven grip on the heartland was broken, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the tide of the war had finally turned for good. But the victory at the Red Ring had come at a price that the Empire could not afford to pay twice. The Imperial military was decimated, its ranks filled with the ghosts of entire legions that had been wiped out in the defense of the capital. The generals reported to the Emperor that while they had won the city, they no longer possessed the strength to continue a protracted campaign into the heart of the Dominion, or even to defend the city against a second, fresh invasion from the south. The Great War had reached a bloody and exhausted stalemate. The Empire had proven that it could still bite, but its teeth were broken and its body was failing. The elven invaders had been repelled from the capital, but they remained a potent and terrifying threat on the borders. As the 175th year of the Fourth Era drew to a close, Titus Mede II sat in the ruins of his palace, surrounded by the rubble of the White Gold Tower, and contemplated the impossible choice that lay before him. He had won the battle, but he was losing the war of attrition, and the survival of the human race hung by a single, frayed thread. The time for heroes had passed, and the time for a bitter, soul-crushing peace was about to begin. The smoke from the Battle of the Red Ring had barely cleared from the ruins of the Imperial City when the realization of the Empire's true state began to settle like a cold, suffocating frost. Though the 175th year of the Fourth Era had seen a brilliant tactical triumph for the human legions, the victory was hollow, a grand but final gasp of a dying giant. Titus Mede II, weary from the weight of a crown that seemed to grow heavier with every drop of blood spilled, sat amidst the wreckage of his palace and looked upon a military that was a mere skeleton of its former self. The legions had won the capital, but they were decimated, exhausted, and utterly unable to push the advantage into the heart of the Aldmeri Dominion. To continue the struggle was to invite total annihilation, yet to stop was to accept a peace that felt more like a slow, agonizing execution. In late autumn of that same year, the Emperor reached for his quill and signed the White Gold Concordat, an act that would arguably do more damage to the unity of man than the elven swords ever could. The terms of the treaty were a bitter draught to swallow, nearly identical to the very ultimatum that the Emperor had rejected with such defiance 4 years earlier. The most immediate and visceral blow was struck against the spiritual heart of the human people. The worship of Talos, the ninth divine, was officially and strictly outlawed throughout every corner of the empire. To the Thalmor Tiber Septim, the man who had ascended to godhood was a blasphemy, a mortal stain upon the divine order of the world that they were determined to erase. Across the continent, the great statues of the Dragonborn god were pulled from their pedestals, and his chapels were shuttered, their incense extinguished by the cold breath of imperial decree. But the treaty went further than a mere ban on public prayer. It granted the Thalmor Justiciars the legal right to operate within imperial lands, allowing elven inquisitors to hunt down heretics and drag them to secret prisons for re-education. This provision turned the cities of the empire into places of whispers and terror, where a neighbor's prayer could become a death sentence, and the emperor's law became the executioner's hand. The second great betrayal of the Concordat was directed toward the empire's most loyal and ancient protectors. The Blades, the legendary order of dragon hunters and imperial guards who had served the Septim bloodline since the dawn of the Second Era, were officially disbanded. The treaty withdrew all imperial protection from the order, effectively declaring them outlaws in the very lands they had died to defend. For the survivors of the earlier purges, there was no sanctuary left. Hunted by Thalmor assassination squads and ignored by the Ruby Throne, the remaining Blades were forced to go underground, burying their ceremonial katanas and their storied history in the dark. The Emperor was now guarded solely by the Penitus Oculatus, an organization of state-loyal agents who lacked the ancient mystical mandate of their predecessors. The loss of the Blades was a symbolic death for the old empire, a sign that the sacred bond between the ruler and his guardians had been severed by the stroke of an elven pen. If the religious and institutional terms were a wound to the soul, the territorial concessions were a blow to the body of the state. The White Gold Concordat demanded that a significant portion of southern Hammerfell, a vast stretch of coastal territory that was vital for trade and defense, be ceded to the Aldmeri Dominion. To the Redguards of Hammerfell, who had bled as much as any legionnaire to repel the elven invaders, this was an unthinkable act of treason. They saw their ancestral lands being handed over to their enemies by a distant emperor who had never set foot in the Alakir Desert. Hammerfell refused to accept the terms of the treaty, openly defying the imperial mandate. In a tragic and necessary move to preserve the tenuous peace with the Thalmor, Titus Mede II was forced to officially renounce Hammerfell as a province, withdrawing the legions and leaving the Redguards to fight the Dominion alone. So this secession was a catastrophic failure of imperial unity, yet it carried an unexpected and uncomfortable lesson for the rest of the world. For 5 long, brutal years, the independent Redguards continued the struggle against the Aldmeri forces, eventually succeeding in driving the Dominion out of their territory entirely. This victory proved to all who watched that the Thalmor were not invincible, and it made the Emperor's earlier surrender look like a cowardly betrayal of human interests rather than a strategic necessity. In the eyes of many, the Empire had traded its honor for a peace that only served its enemies. Hammerfell remained a wary and independent ally, forever changed by the knowledge that when the darkness came, the Ruby Throne would sacrifice its children to save its own white walls. But nowhere was the sting of the Concordat felt more sharply than in the northern province of Skyrim. To the Nords, Talos was not just a god of the Empire, he was a native son, the legendary Tiber Septim, who had walked the snows of the north before ascending to the heavens. He was the ultimate symbol of Nordic pride and the theological cornerstone of their culture. The ban on his worship struck at the very core of their identity, turning every traditional Nord into a potential criminal in their own home. For decades, the ban was largely unenforced, a quiet understanding between the local jarls and the imperial governors who looked the other way as prayers were whispered in the dark. But the seeds of civil unrest had been sown deep in the frozen soil, and fueled by a growing sense of resentment toward an empire that seemed increasingly alien and subservient to elven whims. The economic and social repercussions of the treaty were equally corrosive. The Concordat included provisions for massive gold payments and favorable trade terms that heavily benefited the Dominion, leading to a period of economic stagnation within the human lands. The Empire found itself in a position of humiliating reliance on elven favor, its markets flooded with Alinor goods, while its own industries withered. The White Gold Tower, once the center of continental power, was now a site where Thalmor ambassadors walked with more authority than the Imperial counselors. The atmosphere in the capital was one of a slow, quiet decay, as the people realized that the Great War had ended not in a victory of arms, but in a surrender of the spirit. The 175th year of the Fourth Era should have been remembered for the heroism of the Red Ring, but instead it became synonymous with the signing of the bitter peace. The White Gold Concordat was a document of survival, but it was also a map of future conflicts. By trying to save the Empire from total destruction, Titus Mede II had inadvertently guaranteed that it would tear itself apart from within. The religious persecution, the abandonment of Hammerfell, and the hunting of the Blades created a reservoir of bitterness that would eventually overflow in the years to come. The world was at peace, but it was a peace of the grave, a silence that held no comfort, only the promise that the true reckoning for the Fourth Era was yet to arrive. As the years passed, the terms of the treaty became a constant, grinding pressure on the provinces. The Nords of the North watched as Thalmor justiciars began to arrive in their holds, their black and gold armor a jarring sight against the white snow. The Redguards of the West built their new nation in the shadow of imperial desertion, and in the heart of the empire, the emperor himself aged in a palace that felt like a gilded prison, surrounded by the ghosts of the dynasty he had tried to preserve and the cold, judging eyes of the elves who had outweighted him. The Great War was over, but the great betrayal was just beginning to bear its poisoned fruit. The echoes of the Great War had barely faded into the wind when the first tremors of a new and more intimate catastrophe began to vibrate through the jagged, silver-veined mountains of the West. Or in the 176th year of the Fourth Era, just 1 year after the signing of the bitter white gold Concordat, the focus of the continent's pain shifted to the rugged province of Skyrim and the ancient stone-carved city of Markarth. During the desperate years of the Great War, while the Imperial legions were pulled south to defend the Heartland, a group of native reachmen, known as the Forsworn, had seized the opportunity to reclaim their ancestral lands. They had captured Markarth and established a short-lived independent kingdom, ruling over the stone halls with a fierce and ancient sovereignty. Desperate to retake his hold, the displaced Jarl Hrolfdir turned to a man who had already become a symbol of Nordic resilience, Ulfric Stormcloak. Hrolfdir, acting out of a raw and frantic need to see his city restored, made a secret and dangerous promise to Ulfric and his militia of veteran Nordic warriors. He swore that if they could liberate Markarth from the Forsworn, they would be granted the right to freely and openly worship Talos within the city walls, despite the absolute imperial ban mandated by the treaty with the elves. Ulfric, a man whose faith was as unyielding as the iron of his blade, accepted the challenge. His militia descended upon the Reach with the fury of a winter storm, liberating Markarth in a campaign of brutal efficiency. But the victory was a trap set by history itself. When the Imperial Legion arrived to officially re-establish control over the city, the Thalmor ambassadors were already there, their golden eyes fixed on the breach of the Concordat. Under intense and suffocating pressure from the Aldmeri Dominion, the Empire was forced to make a choice that would forever poison the relationship between the Ruby Throne and the Children of the North. They chose to uphold the treaty over the promise of a minor Jarl. Ulfric Stormcloak and his men, the very warriors who had bled to reclaim the city for the Empire, were arrested and thrown into the cold, damp depths of the Sidna mine. In that darkness, surrounded by the very silver they had fought to protect, the heart of the Nordic resistance was forged. This betrayal turned Ulfric from a loyal soldier into a martyr for the Nordic cause, a man who believed that the Empire had not just surrendered its territory, but its soul. Upon his eventual release from the darkness of the mines, following the death of his father, Ulfric returned to his ancestral seat in the east to become the Jarl of Windhelm. He did not return in peace. He began a slow and methodical mobilization of his people, gathering those who felt the sting of the Talos bond as a personal insult to their heritage. He spoke of a Skyrim that was independent, a Skyrim that did not bow to the whims of elven inquisitors, or a useless emperor who would sacrifice his own subjects to save his white towers. The rebellion he founded, known to all as the Stormcloaks, began as an armed insurrection dedicated to the restoration of the Ninth Divine and the severance of the ties that bound the North to a dying empire. The tension simmered for decades, a low fire beneath the snow, until it finally reached its boiling point in the 201st year of the Fourth Era. Ulfric Stormcloak traveled to the high coastal city of Solitude, the seat of the High King of Skyrim. He did not go to petition or to plead. He went to challenge. In the Blue Palace, before the eyes of the court, Ulfric challenged the young High King Torrik to a traditional duel for the throne. It was a brief and terrifying encounter that lasted only seconds. Ulfric utilized the ancient and nearly forgotten power of the Thuum, the voice of the dragons, to strike Torrik down with the force of a mountain gale. To the Stormcloaks, it was a legal and honorable challenge according to the old ways of the Nords. To the supporters of the High Queen Elisif and the Imperial Legion, it was an act of cold-blooded regicide that threatened to plunge the world into total chaos. The High King was dead, and with his passing, the province of Skyrim was officially sundered in half. The Civil War was no longer a threat. It was a reality that bled the land white. General Tullius, a seasoned and pragmatic commander, was dispatched from Cyrodiil to lead the Imperial Legion in the western holds of Solitude, Whiterun, and Markarth against the rebellion. Ulfric and his Stormcloaks held the old holds of the East, Eastmarch, the Rift, the Pale, and Winterhold, where the tradition of Talos worship burned most brightly. The war was a stalemate of brothers against brothers, a conflict that exhausted the resources and the spirits of the Nords, while the Thalmor watched with predatory patience from their embassy in the mountains. They saw the human nations tearing themselves apart, exactly as they had intended when they drafted the terms of the Concordat. But the instability of the Empire and the blood spilled in the valleys of Skyrim were merely the final omens of a much older and more metaphysical doom. The prophecy of the Dragonborn, etched centuries ago onto the dark stone of Alduin's wall in the hidden Sky Haven Temple, had foretold this exact moment of frailty. The prophecy stated that when the Snow Tower lies sundered, kingless, and bleeding, the World-Eater would return. As the 201st year of the Fourth Era progressed, that prophecy moved from the realm of legend into the realm of fire. The great black dragon Alduin, the herald of the apocalypse who was thought to be a myth of the distant past, emerged from the currents of time to consume the world and end the current Kalpa. The return of the dragons was not merely a local threat to the villages of Skyrim. It was the ultimate alarm that the current order of the world had reached its breaking point. As the Imperial Legion and the Stormcloaks continued their struggle, ancient burial mounds across the province began to crack open, and the shadows of the Sky Terrors once again darkened the earth. The emergence of the last Dragonborn, a mortal blessed by the gods with the soul of a dragon, marked the final chapter of this long, dark century of imperial decline. It was a time of ultimate choosing, where the fate of the Fourth Era and the survival of all creation would be decided by a single individual capable of standing against the World-Eater. The long journey through the ash of Morrowind, the shadows of the floating city, and the blood of the Great War had led to this final, desperate struggle at the end of time. The geopolitical landscape at the dawn of the Dragon Crisis was one of extreme and terrifying fragility. The empire of the Medes had become a skeleton of the glory it once possessed, holding onto only High Rock and Cyrodiil with any measure of certainty. Morrowind remained a wasteland of mourning and refugee camps. Hammerfell was a wary and independent ally that remembered the sting of betrayal, and Skyrim was literally tearing itself in half over the legacy of its gods. The return of the dragons was the final, cosmic confirmation that the foundations of the world had been hollowed out. Whether the last Dragonborn would succeed in saving a world that seemed so determined to destroy itself remained the final, unwritten line of the Fourth Era's history. Good night, traveler. Whatever trials tomorrow may bring, rest now, for you have survived today. May the divines watch over your dreams, and may your road lead you to warm fires